There are betrayals in politics that announce themselves slowly, like a sound you can't quite place at first, and then all at once the whole room turns to look. That is what is happening across Virginia right now. The realization is spreading from the suburbs of Northern Virginia down through Richmond and out into the Shenandoah Valley, household by household, that the woman they sent to the governor's mansion is not the woman they thought they were voting for. And I have to tell you, the buyer's remorse rippling through the Commonwealth, the dawning sense among the very people who put her there that they were sold a bill of goods, none of it surprises me. Not one bit. Because when you build an entire political identity on the careful illusion of moderation, on the performance of being something you are not, eventually the performance ends and the public meets the real person. Abigail Spanberger built her career on that illusion. And in Virginia, the curtain is being pulled back. Let's go back. Because to understand the disillusionment settling over Virginia today, you have to go back to a single morning in 2018 in a district that had no business electing a Democrat. The 7th Congressional District, a stretch of suburban and rural Virginia that had been red for decades, the seat once held by Eric Cantor himself. And here comes Abigail Spanberger, the former CIA officer, running the most carefully calibrated campaign you have ever seen. Everything about it was engineered to reassure. The biography, the national security credentials, the constant, relentless promise that she was not one of those Democrats. She would be independent. She would be a check on her own party. She would represent the district, not the agenda. She stood in front of those moderate, skeptical voters, and she told them, in essence, "You can trust me, I am one of you." And it worked. It worked brilliantly. She won that seat, and then she held it, cycle after cycle, in territory that should have rejected her, by perfecting one skill above all others. The skill of sounding moderate while voting reliably with leadership. The skill of generating the headlines about independence while delivering the votes the party needed. There was the famous moment, caught on a leaked recording after a brutal election night, when she lashed out at her own colleagues, warning them that the far-left rhetoric was killing the party, that they should never use certain slogans again. The press ate it up. Look how brave. Look how independent. Look how willing she is to break with her own side. But notice what it actually was. It was not a disagreement about goals. It was a disagreement about marketing. She wasn't telling her party they were wrong. She was telling them they were saying the quiet part out loud. That was the tell. That was the moment you could see, if you were paying attention, exactly who Abigail Spanberger was. Not a moderate, a messaging strategist, a woman who understood that the words you use to describe the agenda matter more, politically, than the agenda itself. Now here is the part of the story the press in this country will never tell you straight, because the press is invested in the same illusion she is selling. For years, the media built Abigail Spanberger into something she was not. They gave her the glowing profiles. They called her a pragmatist. They called her a centrist. They held her up as the model of the sensible, electable Democrat, the antidote to the excesses of the left. Every time she cast a careful vote or delivered a careful quote, the press rewarded her with another paragraph about her independence. And so the voters of Virginia were handed a portrait of a woman that bore almost no relationship to her actual record. They were told she was a centrist when her voting record was loyal to leadership on the votes that counted. They were told she was independent when the independence was almost entirely rhetorical. The press did the work of laundering the image, and the voters reasonably trusted it. Well, now they are getting an honest accounting, the kind the press never gave them. And it is not pretty. Let's talk about the campaign she ran for governor, because this is where the deception became a governing strategy. In 2025, running for the highest office in the Commonwealth, Spanberger ran the most disciplined exercise in saying nothing I have ever witnessed. She ran as the calm, competent manager. She ran on lowering costs, on cutting through partisanship, on being a steady hand for ordinary Virginia families. She talked about kitchen table issues. She talked about affordability, about being practical, about getting things done. She made herself a blank, reassuring screen onto which moderate and independent voters, exhausted by the noise, could project whatever they wanted to see. And it was, in its own carefully constructed way, one of the most effective deceptions in recent Virginia politics. Because a campaign about lowering costs and being practical is not a mandate for anything. It is the absence of a mandate, dressed up as one. She asked the voters to trust her character rather than scrutinize her plans, and just enough of them did. And the famous promise, the through line of the entire effort, was that she would govern from the center, that she would be a governor for all Virginians, that she would not let the extremes of either party drive the agenda. I will be your governor, not your party's governor. That was the pitch. And the people who pulled the lever for her in the suburbs of Loudoun and Chesterfield, the independents who had voted Republican before, the moderate Democrats who wanted competence over ideology, they took her at her word. They believed they were getting the careful pragmatist from the campaign ads. What they are discovering, vote by vote and appointment by appointment, is that the campaign was the costume and the governing is the truth, and the two were never the same thing. Because here is who is now paying the price for that performance. Think about the actual Virginians who cast that vote in good faith. The small business owner in the Richmond suburbs who heard affordability and lower costs and thought, finally, someone practical, and is now watching the regulatory and tax agenda take shape and realizing it is nothing like what was advertised. The independent voter in Virginia Beach who crossed party lines because he believed the promise of a governor who would resist the extremes, and who now watches the appointments roll in and sees no resistance at all, only alignment. The suburban parent in Northern Virginia who wanted competence and calm and is discovering that calm was a tone, not a policy. These were not partisans. They were the persuadable middle of Virginia, the people both parties fight over, and they extended their trust to a woman who told them she was one of them. And the realization now spreading through those communities, the freezing sense that they were maneuvered, that the moderate they elected was a moderate only until the votes were counted. That is the verdict being rendered right now in real time across the Commonwealth. Now, let's talk about what has emerged since the inauguration, because this is the heart of it, the point where the careful illusion finally collides with the public record. In the early months of her governorship in 2026, the gap between the campaign and the conduct became impossible to paper over. The appointments told one story. The candidate who promised to govern from the center filled her administration not with the bipartisan, pragmatic figures the campaign implied, but with the reliable loyalists and ideological allies of her party's establishment. The early agenda told another story. The affordability talk that defined the campaign gave way to priorities that looked nothing like a kitchen table focus, that looked instead like the standard program of the party she had spent years pretending to keep at arm's length. And as Virginians began to notice, as the local press and the citizens themselves began comparing the campaign promises to the governing reality side by side, the freakout began. Not manufactured outrage. Genuine, spreading, bipartisan buyer's remorse. The slow horror of people realizing they had been read the menu and served a different meal. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters, and her defenders are already working overtime to muddy it. Some will tell you this is exaggerated, that every new governor faces grumbling, that her appointments are normal, that she is governing exactly as a Democrat should be expected to govern. That is a fine distinction if you want to make it. But here is what is not a fine distinction. She did not campaign as a Democrat governing as Democrats govern. She campaigned, deliberately and repeatedly, as something other than that, as the independent pragmatist who would be different, and she won on the strength of voters who believed the difference was real. Whether each individual decision is defensible in isolation does not change what was done in the aggregate. What was done was a bait and switch, an entire campaign built to obscure the governing intention, and the people who fell for it are now seeing it clearly. The deception was not in any single act. The deception was in the gap between the woman on the campaign trail and the woman in the office, and that gap is now fully visible. And it isn't an aberration. It runs through the entire Spanberger story like a thread. You saw it in that congressional career, the rhetorical independence that almost never translated into the votes when leadership actually needed her. You saw it in that leaked post-election tirade, the lecture to her colleagues that was about packaging and not about substance. You saw it in the gubernatorial campaign, the discipline of saying nothing concrete so that everyone could imagine she agreed with them. And you see it now in the governing, the moderate mask coming off the moment the office was secured. One pattern, repeated for years. Present the reassuring image to the persuadable middle, deliver the reliable agenda to the base, and count on a friendly press to keep the two from ever being placed next to each other. For years it worked, because the stakes of a single House seat are low and the scrutiny is light. But the governor's mansion is not a backbench House seat. The whole Commonwealth is watching now, and the pattern, finally, is visible to everyone. So what is the diagnosis? What is really going on here at the deepest level? It is not stupidity. The woman is intelligent, disciplined, an extraordinarily skilled campaigner. The flaw is something more particular and, in its way, more revealing. Abigail Spanberger is a politician who came to believe that managing perception is the same thing as leadership. Her entire formative political experience taught her that you survive by controlling the image, by saying the careful thing, by being whatever the moment requires you to appear to be. She got so good at the performance that the performance became the whole craft. She never had to develop a genuine governing vision of her own because she never needed one. She needed a posture, a tone, a brand. And so she arrives in the most powerful office in Virginia, extraordinarily gifted at telling people what they want to hear, and extraordinarily limited in the one thing that office actually demands, which is the conviction to tell people the truth about what you actually intend to do and then do it. She mastered the campaign so completely that she never learned how to be honest with the people she was campaigning to. And if you want a monument to that hollowness, you do not have to look at a building. Look at the campaign itself, which is the truest artifact of who she is. Look at those careful, focus-grouped advertisements, the soft lighting, the reassuring voice, the words chosen so precisely to mean everything and commit to nothing. Affordability, common sense, a governor for all of us. Watch them again now, with the knowledge of how she is actually governing, and they take on a different character entirely. They are not statements of intent. They are an exercise in misdirection, polished to a perfect shine, designed to win the trust of people whose interests the campaign had no intention of representing once the office was won. That campaign, that flawless, empty, beautifully produced campaign, is the perfect monument to Abigail Spanberger. It looks like a promise. It functions like a trap. If you wanted a metaphor for a politician who is all reassuring surface and no honest substance, you could not do better than the ad that told Virginia exactly what it wanted to hear and meant none of it. Now I want to be fair, because fairness is what separates a real argument from a cheap one. As the disillusionment has spread, the attacks on Spanberger have gotten ugly in ways that have nothing to do with her record. There have been the sneering sexist jabs, the comments about her appearance and her voice that you would never hear directed at a man, the crude insults that substitute mockery for argument. There have been the bizarre conspiracy theories about her CIA background, the unhinged accusations that have no basis in anything. And I'll say it plainly. That is wrong. You can believe Abigail Spanberger ran a deeply dishonest campaign. You can believe she misled the voters of Virginia about who she really is. And you can still believe that she deserves to be criticized for what she has done rather than demeaned for being a woman or smeared with fantasies. Those two things are not in conflict. The case against her conduct is strong enough on the merits. It needs no help from the gutter. The people who reach for the cheap, ugly shot are admitting they don't trust the honest argument to win. I trust the honest argument. It wins on its own. I want to address something directly because I know exactly how this gets framed. The moment you point out that Abigail Spanberger misled Virginia voters, someone will say you're just a sore loser, that you're bitter your side lost, that this is partisan complaining dressed up as principle. I reject that completely. This was never about which party won an election. Elections come and go. This is about something more corrosive than a single race. It is about the practice of winning office by deception, of telling the persuadable middle one thing and governing as something else entirely, because that practice poisons the trust that the whole system runs on. The irony of history, and history is full of ironies, is that Abigail Spanberger's own governing is doing more to expose her than any opponent ever could. Time has a way of doing that. The moderate image is dissolving. The independence is revealed as rhetoric. The affordability promise is fading into a familiar agenda. The bipartisan governor is staffing a partisan administration. The careful trust she built with the middle of Virginia is curdling into the very buyer's remorse she spent years engineering her way around. She was handed every advantage a Virginia politician could ask for: a perfect biography, a friendly press, a reputation for moderation she did not have to earn through actual moderation, the benefit of the doubt from voters who genuinely wanted to believe her, and she is squandering it, not because her opponents were too strong, not because governing is too hard, but because the gap between the woman she presented and the woman she actually is was always going to surface the moment she had to govern instead of campaign. That carefully calibrated congressional campaign back in 2018, the one engineered to reassure a red district that she was one of them, that was the first warning sign. The woman who built her entire rise on the management of perception was always going to govern the only way she knew how, by managing perception, right up until the perception and the reality could no longer be kept apart. It took the Commonwealth a while to catch up to what that original performance revealed, but the reckoning has arrived, and it was, as it turns out, completely inevitable. You cannot win the trust of people by pretending to be something you are not, and expect that trust to survive the moment you start acting like who you really are. You cannot run a campaign as a costume and govern as the truth and expect no one to notice the difference. Someone always, eventually, compares the promise to the performance. And when Virginia compared them, when the voters of the Commonwealth held the campaign up against the governing and saw how little the two had in common, they realized what had been done to them. History will not remember Abigail Spanberger the way her supporters hoped. It will remember her the way the evidence demands.